Fumbling to flowing. As I promised in the lightning talk, this is not a sales pitch for the latest and greatest agile framework. There are a lot of myths out there about Kanban. We'll bust some today. But what I'm in love with when I think about Kanban practices is just how applicable and useful they are to all different types of teams. So I hope you will also emerge with some of that love. Oh, wait. I guess I should turn it on. All right. So my name is Betsy Rosari. I work as a business agility coach, and I'm also a pro Kanban trainer, as you might have guessed from all the love words I'm using about Kanban. My firm is called Fresh Tilt, and we're really focused on helping teams and organizations achieve better customer outcomes and improve ways of working. I love all things about flow, but I'm not tied to any specific frameworks. That's why I kind of describe myself as framework agnostic. And I'm also a big fan of human-centered agility, meaning both the humans doing the work as well as the humans we're serving as customers. So these are the things that make me tick. In today's session, we'll kind of start with the why, start on the problem space of why these things might be useful to you. Then we'll talk about what we mean by Kanban. As I mentioned, there's a lot of myths, so we'll just make sure for at least the next 45 minutes we're all on the same page with what we mean. Then we'll talk about the specific practices and metrics that you might be able to start experimenting with in your own environment, and then wrap it up with some path forward ideas. So let's start with why. So the problem space or the opportunity space, depending on how you like to think of this, is our world is more complex and rapidly changing than ever. And this is not changing, right? Like you probably heard the term VUCA, or volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And this situation is just increasing. So that part's not going to change. Like we're never going back to the days when we know everything and we could just have this perfect known worldview. So that exists, but we also need to be able to deliver to our customers with some degree of predictability and efficiency and effectiveness. So the problem space is really how can these two truths coexist? The solution is Kanban. Just kidding. There's never one easy solution, but I do think that Kanban can be a part of the mix as you're using different tools, different techniques to navigate these two seemingly competing forces. Again, regardless of your current chosen framework, methodology, whatever kind of product you're producing. So a lot of the ideas that I share here today are coming from the Kanban Guide, which if you're not familiar with that, it was published in 2020 with the goal of really being a unifying reference for our community. And what it seeks to do is distill Kanban down to its most essential components. So you can kind of think of it as like the MVP view of Kanban, so that we can all just, understand like what are these basic building blocks that we're working with. And I love this line from the Kanban Guide, that it's a strategy. And the strategy of Kanban is to help us ask the right questions sooner. So I want to make that our rallying cry or our headline for the session. How can we be asking better questions sooner? This isn't going to solve things, but if we can be more aware, if we can have some things that help us ask those better questions sooner as we're continually sensing and responding to the VUCA world around us, that's winning. So I also want to make a disclaimer right up front. As you know, here at TechFest, we're on a track called Optimizing Teams for Fast Flow. If you're trying to optimize teams in a world that is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, there are so many different things to consider. There's a whole bunch of stuff, like any of these bullets could be a whole day workshop in and of themselves around decentralized decision making. Making sure that you have diversity of thought and different experiences on your teams to produce the best solutions for your complex market. How can you experiment? How are your teams empowered to do their best work? All of these things are super, super important, but they are out of scope for this session because we have 45 minutes. So I just want to put that out there. I don't want to say optimizing teams is all about like, hey, just use these practices, because you do absolutely need to be thinking about these other things. But part of it is also, how do you optimize the flow of value? If we're trying to deliver value, which we can all assume we are, how do we optimize that flow? That's the scope that we're talking about today. So, what is Kanban for the purposes of today? So again, it's a strategy. It's not a framework, it's not a process. It's a strategy for optimizing that flow of value through a process that uses a visual and pull-based system. Specifically, there are 3 practices. We're going to go deeper on each of the 3 practices. There's defining and visualizing the workflow, actively managing the items in the workflow, and improving the workflow. And then we have a sweet little set of flow metrics, 4 specific ones we'll look at today, that can help us actively manage items in the workflow and improve the workflow. So, at least for now, if we can start with a blank slate and say this is what we mean by Kanban, we'll work from there. And remember, we're doing these things to help us ask better questions sooner. All right, so let's dive in on some of these practices and the metrics and use some real-world examples along the way. So the first one is defining and visualizing the workflow. Here is a status report. This is a real format that I've seen very, very recently. I scrubbed any identifying data, but this is a program that has a set of features that they have defined to be their MVP release. They're building a new platform, and this is what they're working toward. Some questions that you might ask if you're on this program about how are we progressing toward our MVP release. How well is work flowing? I don't know, a little hard to tell. I guess I could maybe look at some of these percentages. I don't know, it's kind of tough. What feedback are we getting? We have a user acceptance testing phase. Like, what feedback are we getting from our users along the way to help us know if we're on the right track, to help us know if our MVP is likely to be successful? Again, kind of hard to tell from this format, because it's just a bunch of numbers in a spreadsheet. And where is work piling up? You know, where do we maybe need to find some early warning indicators about, is this going to make its dates we hope it'll make? You know, is this on the right track? It's really hard to tell from things like this. So the flip side, or the proposal from a Kanban practice worldview is, what if we made that work visible on a board? So this is the same team. This is what they've defined as their workflow. As they're deploying features toward their MVP, they do intake, refinement, development, end-to-end testing, user acceptance testing, then things are done. So now if we ask these same questions, how well is work flowing as we head toward our first release? What do you guys think? Yeah, like you can see it, right? Like there's this gap here. We've kind of like started the UAT phase. There's this big pile up here. What feedback are we getting from UAT? At the moment, nothing, because there's nothing there. So that might help us ask some better questions about, hey, is there something we could do? Like, are either of these close? Could we maybe swarm? Could we get it across the line? Could we do something, you know, if we are seeking that user feedback? But we're tapping into the power of visuals to ask better questions sooner. Where's work piling up? If you're looking at a visual board, it becomes so obvious. We're working with the way our brains are wired. That's the beauty of visualizing a workflow and having any kind of visible work board. You know, for thousands of years, our brains have evolved to respond to visuals differently than like that spreadsheet view, the written word that we saw before. So we're working with that, which helps us save a lot of mental processing time, which then helps us get to the meaningful conversations and asking better questions sooner. So to me, that's the power of simply just making work visible. You'll see here we're not even talking about like work in progress limits or anything like that yet. That's coming soon. Just making it visible can really flip a switch. So now a story from, this wasn't even a software development team, so here's an example of how some of these practices could be used with other types of teams. So there was a business operations team. They were specifically 14 program managers who were working in a customer service organization. And they were deploying projects, change initiatives that were going out to call center agents. They had a weekly status meeting where they had a spreadsheet style status report, kind of like we looked at, where everyone showed up. Basically, like when your row was called, you like read what was in the row and then you stepped away. So not very effective, not very efficient, but also the team members were saying that they didn't really understand like how these things connected. They were lacking that holistic understanding. And they also felt very disconnected because they just came for an hour waiting to like read out their 2 rows and then they went away. So there was opportunity here to maybe experiment with some different things to see if they could have some different conversations and ask better questions sooner. There was also a problem because they were all deploying their projects to the same end users, to call center agents. And this was a population that reported very high change fatigue and had very, very high turnover rates, which was having a real impact to the business. So there was a real problem space that this group was contributing to because they didn't understand that bigger picture and how all of the pieces fit together. So we said, what if we just start making all work visible on a board instead of in a spreadsheet? Again, we weren't even talking about the WIP limits or anything like that yet. We said, let's just start visualizing it very simply. We used a Miro board and use that for our weekly meeting and see if it changes anything. We said we would let it run for 3 months, this experiment. We took some data along the way. And happily, the results were good. So we saw 23%, this was self-reported, this was these 14 program managers, reported that they had a 23% increased ability to connect the dots between projects, which mattered because then they were able to bundle things, they were able to communicate things differently to the end users, they were able to find efficiencies rather than just deploying everything individually. They had a 30% increase in how to overcome obstacles and challenges. So as far as feeling disconnected from the team or feeling isolated, this made a big difference because they understood how they could work together as a team to overcome obstacles. And they had that better holistic understanding. So again, I just want to share this because the lift is pretty low and the impact can be pretty big. So if you want to get started with this first practice of defining and visualizing the workflow, I know this is a dense slide, but there are some questions on the left that you could, again, tomorrow, you could go back and start discussing these with your team. And it is really important that this is discussed with the team, with the people doing the work. So really, really critical is agreeing on what represents value in your space. If we're saying we're trying to optimize the flow of value, we need to be sure that we're on the same page about like what type of value are we trying to deploy and optimize that. Or else we risk sub-optimizing for maybe a sub-function or something like that. So what represents value? What are the steps we take to get value out the door? How are we going to manage work in progress together to improve flow? What are the working agreements that we want to put in place as this moves, from end to end? We are still humans working together to deliver value, so what kind of agreements do we want to make to each other as a team? And then as far as like the actual visualization of your workflow, again, like don't let tooling get in the way. I work with a lot of places who are like, well, our JIRA is set up this way, we have to do it exactly this way, we don't have any flexibility, it doesn't represent what we actually want to show. Okay, so can you start with a Miro board? Can you start with a Word doc? If you're together, can you have a physical whiteboard? Is there something you can do, again, to just start experimenting with this practice and see if it helps you ask better questions sooner by being more aware of the big picture? So any questions on this first practice? Kind of ask for questions along the way. All right. The second practice is actively managing items in the workflow. So once we've defined our workflow and visualized it, so we said we know what kind of value we're trying to deliver, here are the steps we take to get it there, and here's our nice board where we look at all of our work in progress together. We need to manage the stuff within it. We can't just kind of like dump it and forget it. So let's do a little game. You can all do this. You can either do it like silently in your head or you can whisper to yourself. I need my phone for this. But I'm going to ask you to do a couple things. So first, you're going to say letters A through J. So in your head or whispering, you're going to say A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J. And then you're going to do numbers 1 through 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. After you do that, raise your hand, and I'll just kind of, clock the room and see about how many seconds that takes everyone. So sorry, I can't multitask. None of us can. Let me get into my stopwatch, and I'll say go in just a second. So again, you're going to get A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and then raise your hand. So, ready, go. All right, 4 or 5 seconds, nice. Now, do the same thing, but do A1, B2, C3, D4, until you get to J10. Ready? Go. All right. So first ones were around 9 seconds, the majority was around 13, 14 seconds. Yikes. What happened? How did round 2 feel versus round 1? Anyone want to share?
It's way harder to switch context.
Yep. What else?
That's what I was going to say. Simple task, context switching in your head from letters to numbers.
Yeah, there's a big price we pay for that.
The deeper you went into it, the more complicated it got.
Yeah. When I try to do it, my quality slips. I'm like, C7. No, that's not right. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. So the point of that, it's a very, very simple example, but it's exactly what you guys said. It's the cost of context switching. So if you know sort of about this lean flow world, a lot of it comes from manufacturing. There's this idea of single piece flow. I fully acknowledge in our knowledge work environments, our corporate environments, we're not going to be achieving single piece flow. But we just need to be aware of the very real cost of too much work in progress, which leads to too much context switching and slows us down significantly. So that's the point of that. So this is where we get to the WIP limits, which really is at the heart of any kind of a lean, pull-based flow system. We have to manage our work in progress. How you do that is very much up to the team. So as you're defining and visualizing your workflow, you need to just have some conversations about, where might we start experimenting with WIP limits? You can have WIP limits across a whole board, across a whole system. You can have WIP limits by column. Whatever makes sense to you, start somewhere with an acknowledgement that it's going to serve you and your customers and your stakeholders to limit your WIP. And then use some of the other techniques we'll be talking about to ask better questions sooner. Is this working for us? Use the metrics to monitor how it's going. So lots of benefits. Again, with only 45 minutes, we can't go super deep on this, but know that we do need to limit WIP to promote flow, to make things more efficient, effective, and predictable. Okay, better questions sooner. You guys sick of hearing it yet? All right, let's play around with better questions sooner. So this is the first flow metric I'll introduce, and it's almost like a stretch to call it a metric because it's so straightforward, but it is also kind of transformational for people that are not looking at their work in progress in a visual way today. So this is simply the metric of work in progress, which is just a count of work items that are in your system. So a couple important things to point out on this slide. You'll see the started and finished. That comes from when you're defining and visualizing your workflow. If you're going to agree on here's the type of value we're trying to deliver and here are the steps that it takes, you also need to be clear on when does something cross the start line, when do we consider something to be in our workflow, and when does it end. And the fun thing is you can have multiple start and finish points. Maybe you're looking at metrics and cycle time and flow for things that start with customer discovery, user experience research, but maybe for your dev team, you have a different, subsequent start point of after things have been refined and it's actually in the flow. So you can experiment with all of that as you define your workflow. However you're thinking of it, between your start and finish point, you just simply count the number of items. So here they have analysis, development, testing, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So that's why their WIP metric right now is 9. They have also, you'll notice on the board, they have set up some WIP limits for themselves, they being the team who's doing this work. So they've divided their analysis column into active and finished, and they've said for everything in active and finished, we're only going to allow ourselves two work items at a time. So their WIP limit is 2 for analysis. For development, they said we'll allow ourselves 3 things between active and finished. And for testing, they've said we'll allow ourselves 2 things. So if you're a member of this team, what questions might you ask when you are looking at this board in your daily huddle?
The dev team is 4.
Yeah. What? Yeah, 5 actually. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Because across both. So why do we have 5 when we said that we were going to limit ourselves to 3? That would be a great question. Any other questions you might ask? Analysis. Oh, so they're actually at their WIP limit of 2, but it might be a good question to ask of is that working for us? Is that the right level? Is analysis bored? If they're bored, could they help with dev? If they're, asking some of those kind of questions, absolutely.
Can we swarm anything in testing so we can move some of the development stuff over?
Love that. And why did you start with testing for swarming?
Because we want to focus on finishing work so we can move stuff over.
Beautiful. Yes. So is there something we could do here? Are there people on the team that could help us clear up some of the stuff in testing, even though they're at their WIP limit, because that helps us get something across the finish line and deliver that value we're trying to do, Plus, then it helps the flow upstream and might help some things flow through. So this is just an example of the first metric, the first visualization, and how it can help us ask better questions sooner. The next metric I'll introduce is work item age. It's defined as the amount of elapsed time between when a work item started and the current time. So it's literally just a clock. So again, you've defined your workflow, you have your start and finish point. As soon as it crosses the start point, you start that clock, and you think about the time that it's been in your system. Any ideas why we should care about that?
It's an indicator that something's kind of holding everything else up. It just shows you if there's some problem, some block, something's going on with it.
Yeah, totally. It could give us that early warning indicator if something's stuck, is something amiss.
I was gonna say something similar, it could be a very big task that needs to be broken up.
Yeah.
Or somebody has a training need, something.
Yeah. Do we have the opportunity to split it up to deliver a smaller chunk of value sooner? All great questions we could be asking sooner. Another critical thing about work item age, or the longer an item lingers, is stuff happens. Remember our problem space, we're in a VUCA world, right? The longer something exists in your flow, the more likely a COVID is to hit, or something, or who knows what, both within the workflow as well as in your customer space. All of those work items are little mini hypotheses. We think they're gonna deliver value, but we never know what's gonna actually deliver value until it makes contact with the real world. So the goal is to get things across the finish line and either validate or invalidate those hypotheses as quickly as possible. So the longer something is lingering in your system, the more risk there is. Stuff's gonna go wrong, dependencies are gonna block it, or maybe your customers, the environment that you're trying to deliver value into, changes in a significant way, and oops, then we just had all of that inventory cost, we had all of that waste. So it's interesting, from Pro Kanban, they actually say this is the #1 metric to watch, which when I went through my Pro Kanban training, that was kind of eye-opening to me, but I think I'm coming around to that point of view. So how might this look? Again, how might you get started with this? You might have tooling in place that does this beautifully, wonderful. Like if your Jira shows you exactly, how long it's been in flight since your defined start point, great. If not, a hack that I've seen is, I know this is tiny, sorry. So for this team, they have intake, refinement, development in progress, end-to-end testing, UAT, and done. Start and finish is here. So as soon as something crosses the start point, they just edit the title of their work item and list the date it was started. So then it's right there in their face when they're looking at the board. Nobody has to dig and try to figure out how old these tickets are. You can see in UAT, they have this ticket was started on July 13th, this one was started on July 18th. So if they're really focusing on work item age, which one do you think they're gonna wanna talk about first and focus on first? The older one, yeah. And then there's one over here, and in progress, this started June 29th. This one started July 28th, this one started August 3rd. So what kind of better questions might you ask if you see that hanging out on your board? Why are we blocked? What can we do? Who can we go talk to? So again, there are easy ways, easy lifts, and potentially really big impacts to starting to just be more aware of work item age. Any questions on practice 2? Yeah?
Can Kanban boards also be used to develop estimates of time? Because in my experience, that's been mine.
We're getting to it. That's a great segue. So yeah, we'll talk about estimates a little bit, and there's a lot more we could talk about estimates beyond this, so yes.
I have a question.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
With that idea there
Mhm.
of putting started at the start of the task,
Mhm.
was that idea to put it there like when it's in the like options column, or to update it as you move it through the flow?
Depends on where you want to consider your start point. So this is where it might be tricky if you're trying to think about multiple start points. But the goal would really be, if this is where you feel that you're starting to sort of monitor and control your own workflow, you would put the started on as soon as it crosses this start line. So this team has said, this is a little bit out of our control for whatever reason. So what we're gonna try to start actively managing for ourselves right now is when it moves to dev, so that's the date they're gonna put.
Okay.
Yeah. Any other questions on this one? practice is improving the workflow. So here's where the beautiful spirit of continuous improvement comes in, which we hear in all aspects of everything we do, including the keynote, striving for excellence. We're trying to continuously improve the workflow. So the first metric to introduce here is throughput, which I know triggers some things in some people sometimes, because this is quite simply a count of the number of work items finished per unit of time. You get to decide the unit of time. You can even look at multiple different units of time. So you can say throughput per week. Let's say you're doing 2-week sprints. You can say throughput per sprint, throughput per quarter. Look at them all. They might help you ask better questions sooner. So any ideas of what that might be useful for versus maybe what it's not so useful for?
Measuring progress, not useful for evaluating team performance on its own.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, so definitely it can be useful for just like how are we doing? You know, do we have some level of predictability or consistency where we do 10 work items per week? Okay. Are those work items meeting the need of the end user? Are they effective? Are they meeting the business need? That's a whole different conversation you need to have. You know, so if we put through 10 things that end up being wasteful or not used, that's a different conversation. But there's big use and understanding, you know, do we kind of regularly crank through 10 work items per week? Because then it can be used for simple estimating. For a stakeholder, you want to think about how many work items we might want to talk about planning for the next month. Don't anchor on exactly 10, if 10 is your number. Don't say exactly 40. We're going to get to in a second talking about ranges and probabilities. That's a healthy way to have these kind of conversations. But this can be useful for that. You can say 85% of the time, we do about 10 items a week. Let's talk about what might your top 35 to 40 items be. So throughput can be helpful for those kind of conversations. The other thing throughput can be really helpful for is it's good at measuring the departure rate from your system. So again, how many work items are coming out of our system per unit of time? Let's say you do have that 10 per week, but things are coming into your system at 50 per week. There's some questions to be asked there. There's some conversations to be had. Do we need to grow our team? Is there somebody else that can help with this work? Is there some other way that we might want to address that mismatch? But it's useful for that as well. Any questions on throughput? I think that, yeah, that's all I have for throughput.
What about the size of the thing?
Mm-hmm.
Is that for?
So we'll get to it a bit when we talk about cycle time, which is the next metric. But like this is a big thing in the Kanban space of do all things need to be exactly the same size? And the beautiful simple answer is no. But there is a concept of sort of right sizing. So if you just let data flow through your system for a while and you start to get like these range of probabilities and cycle times and all these great metrics, what you'll see is there's always some randomness in the data. Remember, we're in a VUCA world, like that's just our world. There's always going to be randomness in the data. You'll also see, I ran a fun experiment with a team who they were really fixated on story points, and we have to have the perfect story points. And this absolutely, I know we're not supposed to use 2s, but we need a 2 and not a 3. Like it was the wrong conversation to be having. So instead, we looked at some flow metrics, and then we applied filters by story points. And the pattern of randomization and time was exactly the same between their 1s and 3s and 5s and 8s. So what that did is it kind of helps you have a different conversation of, okay, if stories are what we as a team say, like this is our work item and this feels to be about like other stories we've done, that's enough. Don't spend half an hour talking about if it's a 3 or a 5. Like that's not the valuable point. If you say this feels like roughly what we do in general, bring it into your system and focus on getting it through your system as quickly as possible. So that's where the sizing thing comes in. Kind of make sure it's like the right thing for your system. You know, the team will have that gut feel of, no, this is actually 5 months worth of work, whereas normally our stuff is 2 days worth of work. But if they feel like it's in the zone, just bring it in and focus on getting it done, because there will be surprises along the way. So I know that's not like a super, you know, defined answer, but is that in the vein?
I don't know.
Okay, we can chat more after. Okay, so the next metric, how am I doing on time? Next metric is cycle time, which is defined. It's a lagging indicator, it's backward looking. This is only for things that have been completed. This is defined as the amount of elapsed time between when a work item started and when it finished. So again, it's just a clock, but it's not a proactive clock like work item age of, uh-oh, this thing's getting really old. It's looking backwards and reflecting on how did things go. So we're going to do a little scenario for this. Kelvin is visiting Pittsburgh for a business trip. He is staying at the Airport Marriott, and he's heard it's so amazing to drive into Pittsburgh through the Fort Pitt Tunnel. So he's planning to drive that route next Wednesday morning. He's going to leave the hotel, he's going to leave the airport at 7:45. What time should Kelvin plan his first meeting downtown?
Noon.
Yep. So what went on in your head when you said noon?
The entirety of Parkway.
Mm-hmm.
And airport and downtown.
Yes. Yes. Those of us from Pittsburgh, I assume most of the room, understands just how much variability might be in that process on, 376 coming through the tunnel. So here's where we introduce the idea of that variability is going to show up. There's an excellent book called When Will It Be Done? Might be a good read, good reference if you guys want to look at it. But it says forecasts are all about describing the future. We know the future is full of uncertainty. So given that we might have a multitude of possible outcomes, we need to take a probabilistic approach, which is a word I struggle with, probabilistic, not a deterministic one. So deterministic means yes, customer, we are absolutely going to have this release done on April 3rd with exactly this scope. Like how many times have we been burned by that? Yet we still continue to have those conversations. So this is just a much healthier and more realistic way to have these kinds of conversations, which are still needed. We can't swing the pendulum the other way. We can't say, oh, it'll be done when it's done. No, we still need to plan, but there are healthier ways to have this conversation. So what this book asserts is if you're taking this probabilistic approach, you should be talking about forecasts in the terms of a range of outcomes. So there's probably an 85% certainty this will occur, or a 50% certainty this outcome will occur, and the probability associated with it. And it's based on actual performance data. So it's not guessing. It's not sitting there for half an hour saying, is this a 3 or 5 story points and how many days is a story point? It's looking at your actual past delivery data, which inherently captures all of that variability in your system. So as long as things are like roughly the same, as long as you're still working on roughly the same product, you use that data to forecast the future. So back to Kelvin. Here's a cycle time chart from June of if you left the Airport Marriott at 7:45 a.m., what time would you arrive downtown? So the way you read cycle time scatter plots is each blue dot is a data point. So date is across the bottom, and amount of time is on the y-axis. So for example, on June 8th, if someone left the Airport Marriott at 7:45, they would have had a 38-minute commute to downtown. June 19th, that was Taylor Swift weekend. It would have taken 55 minutes, even at that time in the morning, just before coming downtown and hanging out. So you can plot this out, and you see, it's okay that Taylor Swift came. That's okay. We can talk about that. We can ask better questions sooner. Did you have a question? Oh. And then the other thing we've added here is the calculation around what are those percentages. So just looking at your data set, you quite simply say 50% of our points of data are below 30 minutes. So that's where that 50% line comes in. 85% are below 39 minutes, and 95% are below 42 minutes. And what that allows you to do is have these different conversations of, hey, what time should he leave? Well, maybe it depends on, is his first meeting going to be meeting up with a college friend for coffee who, has a lot of forgiveness and flexibility? Okay, maybe he's comfortable with 50th percentile, and he says, I'll leave 30 minutes in advance. Is his first meeting going to be with the CEO of a big company who he's trying to do business with? Then he probably wants to take the approach you took of let's give it a few hours, right? Let's go for that 95th percentile or 85th percentile. These lines in Kanban terms are called service level expectations. And they're an important part of as you define and visualize your workflow and start to use some of this data for forecasting and predicting the future, if you will. It's important to think about those ranges. So any questions on this? Just standing up the data? Yeah, it probably depends. It depends on, do you have access to previous data? Like, could you, if you're using Jira, could you go into Jira and look at like the start date of tickets? Otherwise, a surprisingly few number of data points are needed to start making this work, like around 10. So if you are doing 10 work items per week, not to over-anchor on that example, like just start gathering data for a week and then start looking at the forecast. The other important point of this is as information changes, we have to update our forecast. So keep monitoring these metrics over time. These aren't a one and done. This isn't look at your first 10 data points and forever make predictions on that. Because if you're continuously improving your workflow, which is the practice we're talking about, hopefully you're seeing improvements in these types of data points. So, continually as a team start to think about what does forecast look like if we use our first ever 10 data points versus our most recent 10 data points. And then keep those forecasts, like this is a key point of it, and compare it to what actually happens. So again, you can ask those questions, refine your understanding, improve your practice.
And you can break this up like category work too.
Sure. Yeah.
Like how they.
Yeah.
Very,
Whatever makes sense for the team, absolutely. Yeah. And this is another area, this is the chart I was talking about with the team that I ran the one that was all fixated on story points, and we ran this experiment. We just filtered and got a different cycle time chart by story point level, and the pattern, the times were all the same. So it's like, maybe we don't need to spend as much mental energy thinking about story points, and let's just instead do the work. So, path forward. So hopefully, some of these examples and ideas throughout have given you some ideas to try. Just reminding everyone of the 3 practices, so defining and visualizing the workflow, actively managing items in the workflow, improving the workflow. The idea is that Kanban is really, useful when all 3 of these practices are working in tandem. But don't let the idea of all 3 stop you from starting to experiment. Remember some of those early stories I shared about just making work visible, how powerful that can be and how it can transform some conversations. So, just start to experiment with any of these that speak to you, any of these that might be accessible to you, and see where it gets you. There's kind of this also beautiful idea in the Kanban world of manage the work, not the workers. Not to be taken to extremes, because if you also remember the caveat about we're trying to create the environment of empowered, engaged workers, all of those great things, we want to be creating that environment. What is not healthy and helpful is to say exactly how many hours worth of work did this person do today, exactly what was this person's throughput, because that's not the point. The point is the system, the value delivery system, and how that's flowing and how we're improving that. And then just finally this idea of these practices are helping you optimize the flow of value. Coming back to the idea, if we believe processes exist to deliver value, let's try to optimize it. And that's true for anyone working on any kind of team, not just software development. So that's where this beautiful Kanban for everyone idea comes from. If you do want to learn more, I have a mini workshop on flow metrics where we'll do some hands-on activities and go deeper into the flow metrics we talked about here. That's next Tuesday. And then there's a little bit more in-depth applying professional Kanban class in October. It's 3 afternoons, October 24th to 26th. $200 off. Any TechFest attendees who might want to come, just reach out to me. But that's a fun class because we really get to do some hands-on things and explore it within your own context. And here's my QR code to my LinkedIn page. I love this stuff. I'll go back to the love word. I would love to connect with any of you, talk about it further, and hear how your experiments are going as you start to experiment with these practices. So thank you very much for coming.